Good afternoon. My name is Ronald Grant and I worked in Aberdeen cinemas for 14 years, mostly for the family firm James F. Donald. At the beginning of the 1950s, they ran 12 of Aberdeen's 16 cinemas, as well as His Majesty's Theatre. Here's one of their matchbooks, once available at the sales kiosks. Every weekday evening, the Evening Express would feature on page 2 a paid-for list of Aberdeen entertainments. At the top was His Majesty's Theatre. Others today are dealing with Aberdeen theatres, so I limit myself to only the film connection. In the periods between shows or plays, Her Majesty's ran what were then politely called continental films. But before going further, I should mention an incident that transformed my life and is directly related to Aberdeen cinemas and the Donalds. In 1981, I came to spend a week in Aberdeen, which I hadn't visited for a decade. While walking down Skene Terrace, in the street just to the right of the black car, seen here, I met Richard Donald, and aware that they'd closed a number of their cinemas, I asked what had happened to their projectors. He said at that very moment they were being broken up for scrap. Horrified, I persuaded him to take me to the offices, and in a room the floor was lined up with over 20 projector mechanisms being dismantled. Expressing interest in several, as instructed, I made an offer for them. Mr. Donald then told me they had to vacate a former church in Rose Street, which had been sold to be converted to housing. It had to be cleared urgently, and if I was interested in this old junk, indicating the projectors, I should go and have a look. It turned out to be a huge packed Aladdin's cave, which had housed the company's permanent staff of painters and carpenters. An offer had to be made. Having bought and saved what I could, my partner Martin and I decided to give the material some purpose, and we formed a non-profit making company called the Cinema Museum in 1984. 2 years later, it was granted charitable status, the core of the museum originally being the Aberdeen material, so a number of items that tell part of the Aberdeen cinema story are still surviving, and will illustrate what I can tell you of Aberdeen's cinemas. This is the fragrance that was sprayed regularly in Donald's cinemas. Next was the Capitol, opened in 1933. Originally, the site had been a motor dealer's. The garage sign can be seen on the right at the upper end of Union Street. It was opened as the Electric Theatre in 1910. Aberdeen Picture Palaces decided to replace the old Electric, and here we see it being demolished. The initial plans retained the original name, which was replaced by Capitol. And here you can see the attractive, stylish frontage with the Art Deco influenced doors. The Capitol is described here as the most luxurious cinema in Scotland, and elsewhere as Scotland's finest cinema. The coming super cinema, the impressive doors, and from the inside. And here later, after having a wheelchair slope cut into the front step, I feel that dividing this immensely dignified and stylish building into Jumpin' Jacks and the Chicago Rock Cafe was the beginning of the end for this precious and beautiful building. Here is the area between the outer and inner doors, the centre stairs to the balcony foyer, and at either side stairs down to the stalls foyer. The doors above lead into the balcony foyer from the left side, showing one of the staircases to the back balcony with a matching stair to the left. Looking from the edge of the former cafe area above the entrance, the stalls foyer. From a 1930s picture of the cafe. Above the front doors it was, with a view out to Union Street. Looking forward, the auditorium from the stage. Looking forward, with the Compton organ having been raised through a trapdoor on the stage, which had been extended forward for live events. from the front balcony showing the organ grills at either side. A back balcony view. The Capitol hosted many entertainers. Robert Wilson, seen here, was a very, very popular singer who was known for his rendering of the northern lights of old Aberdeen. In the late 1950s, Harold Fielding's Music for the Millions was very popular, and I remember seeing singer, entertainer and film star George Formby appear. The Capitol was packed. This is the cyclorama on the stage, which could be lit, projected on, and I believe lifted up into the fly tower if not required. The stage lighting board, the mercury arc rectifier and the projection box, a surviving bulb, on display in London. The projection room in the early talkie period. Note lower centre the sound on disc turntable for playing the recordings of the soundtrack. Later, with more recent Western Electric equipment installed, the lighting board seen controlled the holophane lighting system. The dimmers and other control gear were in a separate room behind the board. This is the fly tower, showing more clearly the side of the auditorium, and the alterations to the fly tower with Jumpin' Jacks and Chicago Rock Cafe displayed. I'm pleased I haven't had to see the further terminal damage to this exceptional building, of which only the frontage may survive. The Majestic, Union Street, and opposite the Union Street end of Bonnecourt Street. The pugnacious Tom Scott Sutherland was the Aberdeen architect designing the Majestic, his third Aberdeen Cinema. This replacement for the previous La Scala, the Majestic opened in 1936 and closed in 1973 to be replaced by this. The Majestic. I have a soft spot for its memory. My mother ran off with a soldier near the start of the war, leaving my brother and I with my father. But she left behind a diary in which she records that she went to the Majestic to see Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs on its initial screening, and that it was Baby's first film, and that he was very good. As a 2-year-old, I remember nothing of it, although I've seen it again since. This was my first film. If you look at the square object above the pay desk window, which says "Pay Here," and at the stills frame, half hidden by the furthest door, well, I'm glad to say they both survive. In this picture of the stall's foyer, inside the double set of glass doors, just beyond the confectionery kiosk, is a stills frame on the wall with a curved top. Parallel with the angle of the stairs, there is on the wall a notice that points up to the cafe on the first floor. I'm pleased to say they were also saved. The Majestic sign now directs customers to the Cinema Museum Cafe. The Majestic sandwich board. I remember the man who wore it walking up and down Union Street, advertising the Majestic's current programme. Jim Brooks, an Aberdeen enthusiast, borrowed a camera from Fred MacLeod, who'd been a projectionist at the Astoria, and photographed Aberdeen cinemas in the 1970s, some of which are peppered through this account. The majestic proscenium arch and festoon curtain, not too long before these horrific scenes. Compared to some of the other halls, the Majestic appeared shorter, with a proscenium arch wide enough to allow a larger screen when widescreen arrived. A long panel underneath the canopy above the pavement declared until the end, "See it on the giant panoramic screen." The balcony seating seems steeply enough raked to avoid the head of the person in front, obstructing the view. The cafe and the balcony foyer. The doors leading into the balcony. The carpet. Sad scenes. the ventilators towering over the destruction. Another cinema designed by Scott Sutherland was the Astoria off Great Northern Road and near the Cattle Mart pens at Kitty Brewster, under construction. Open and up and running. After the first year, the Donalds bought 51% of the shares and took over control. The Astoria front door was very fine Art Deco styles. The interior doors behind these were of a different design. 2 sets of them still survive, along with some other pieces of the Astoria. The Astoria was the only cinema of the Donalds to have RCA sound. The acoustics and sound there were much praised. The scene from Powers Terrace, with the Astoria's roof ventilators prominent in the distance in the centre right. The City Cinema on George Street was reputed to be Aberdeen's largest, at 2,700 seats. It was built in land behind 2 George Street shops, which were lost to make the entrance. On the inside of the entrance foyer was a small room filled with posters which were distributed to all the Donald cinemas. The clearing out of the redundant publicity when it closed to become a bowling alley also affected my life. Saving this material from the council bin men filled my car almost to the roof twice and included many publicity items from 30 years earlier. The older ones were being torn into strips and the plain backs used to make lists. The manager kept a big bundle for that purpose, which I never got him to relinquish. Here's a few from the hundreds, whisked away, with Mr. Donald's permission, before the bin men came. And here's the interior. There were 4 blocks of seats. There's a block on the right that's missing in the picture. The projection room in 1951. The flexible tubing above allowed the white smoke from the burning carbon rods to escape. The nearest projector, always known as number 1, is showing a film. You can see the light shining through the window in front. As usual, the floor is polished daily by the apprentice. The same space after the cinema was converted to a bowling alley. Here are some surviving articles. And here's the new frontage, a different operator. This is a side view. I have a very soft spot for the Playhouse. It was where I entered the film business professionally as an apprentice projector operator at a weekly wage of £1.19 and a penny. In decimal money, £1.95 a week. Here at the top of Union Street we see, behind the man with the bowler hat, the shop at number 475 of the Aberdeen Dairy Company. If you note, all the premises have a basement with sunks protected by railings. I'll refer to them later. In a former billiard hall above their premises, James F. Donald opened it in 1915 as the West End. Only one projector, which meant a wait between films, while the next threaded into the machine. Music was from an automatic player piano. Heating was by stoves, and with the dairy below, it was nicknamed Tuppenny Freezer. When Mr. Donald's lease expired in 1920, Aberdeen Picture Palaces stepped in with the intention to develop and enlarge it, and so the Picture Playhouse, as it was called, opened in 1921. Seating was for 1,036. Young Nowheres is from 1929. The man on the left is an important figure in the Aberdeen Picture Palaces, Bertie Gates. In the centre between the 2 doors is an external pay desk. This is a mid-1950s picture taken by me showing the staff foreman, Claude Monaghan, on the left in his tuxedo with a grey facing on the lapels. On the floor between the double doors behind the foreman, there was a large mat in a recess. Beneath the mat was a trapdoor leading into a cellar, a legacy of the old basement seen in the early photo, where I was told the silent film sound effects machines were still there. Oh, to have been at the demolition and rescued them. I saw Saw this copper plate in a bin in Mr. Monaghan's office. I was aghast. Why was it being thrown out? And was told it had been displayed outside, but Mr. Clapperton had died, and therefore the plate could no longer be displayed. So, almost 70 years later, here it still is. I remember the still frames in the showcases being replaced. They too have survived. The central pay desk has gone now, the chrome facings of the playhouse sign looking corroded and grubby. The owner of the building was James Scott, who owned the shop next door to the right, and a large builder's yard accessed from the rear and below the playhouse, which was on metal stilts above it. Behind the vacuum cleaner, seen on the left, is a large still frame which survives. The standee still frame with the poster across it also survives. It would appear that Scott sold all the premises early in the 1970s when, in a desperate attempt to keep going, the playhouse had changed its policy downward to continental fare, and the playhouse closed in 1974 and was replaced by this. I understand it's the building on the left. This was the manager when I started at the Playhouse in the 1950s, William Findlay Perry, a very important figure in Aberdeen cinema history. This photo shows him around 1924. He'd been manager of the Star, Park Street, where he and Mrs. Perry would stand behind the screen and read out the silent film intertitles, where many adults had difficulty reading and where there are several recorded accounts that people paid for admission with empty jam jars. They also made sound effects, and I remember when at the Playhouse Herbert Donald had found in his desk drawer a small Derringer pistol that fired blanks, the shots creating realism in westerns at the Starry, as it was affectionately known, retained with affection as a souvenir of his faraway pioneering sound effects days. He was livid on his return to find Mr. Donald had confiscated it as dangerous. In the mid to late 50s, two large floodlights on stands were placed in front of the gold curtains. From memory, one had a green gelatine sheet across it and the other red. So now, as the house lights rose and fell, so did the floods on the curtains. The two exit doors at either side of the screen led down concrete stairs to exit onto Justice Mill Lane. The swan-necked fitting on the wall on the right was lit by gas. Identical fittings were distributed throughout the building and were kept at a lowish level in the auditorium to avoid distraction. The operating room, showing from the left the Western Electric amplifier, the internal telephone, over which downstairs staff foreman Claude Monaghan rang up to tell me that President Kennedy had been shot and killed. The West Star pedestal, topped by the peerless Magnarch, which created the light that shone through the film onto the screen. Then the Super Simplex projector with a full spool in the top spool box, and below a Western Electric Model 2002 soundhead with an empty spool in the bottom spool box. A reverse view showing the rear of the projector and soundhead, but reveals the base of the Premier slide lantern near the top, and at the bottom of the frame the double pole ironclad switch which diverted the current from the arc above across to the slide lantern. Slides advertising the show or play at His Majesty's Theatre, Donald's Ice Rink, and that ices, drinks and cigarettes were on sale, was shown at every performance. Then beyond is the sliding door, which in a dubious interpretation of the regulations was permanently open. Here we see the concrete plinth the projectors were on with a transit case by the rewind room door. The heavy-duty battleship linoleum was highly polished and kept so by the apprentice. The open door was an emergency exit and is about 3 feet above the floor of the emergency exit from the corner of the back balcony, which through the open exterior doors opened onto a metal staircase which led down into the builder's yard below. And here are some of the slides that you might see at every performance. My free pass to the other cinemas that were owned or controlled by James F. Donald Aberdeen Cinemas, 2 dated coupons a week was the allocation. My teenage self on the roof just outside the projection room showing the city vista. On the roof again, this one shows more clearly the closeness of the capital. Tragic photo by Michael Thompson of the Playhouse's End in 1974. I later heard that an enthusiast had rescued the Playhouse sign. It landed up in the possession of Aberdeen Art Gallery. The Kingsway Cinema was on the corner of King Street and Frederick Street. As you can see, the Kingsway entrance was created below housing. This is a combination of 2 photos to get a wider picture. The top picture was taken when the Donalds ran the bingo early on and shows one of the entrances into the stalls and the staircases to the balcony foyer. These appear to have been altered by the later bingo operator, so the staircases no longer turn round at the bottom. The lower picture shows the front doors as seen on the far left. On the far right, the corner of a black rubber floor mat can be seen. A pair of them survive. This is a newsreel poster shown in the Kingsway display board, which, as you'll notice, is in the shape of a thistle, one of Scotland's symbols. The original foyer looking towards the entrance, with the staircase's original final steps into the foyer, the lower picture showing the later alteration. The upper picture shows the original layout. A bingo company installed a suspended ceiling with brighter lighting, and the seats were replaced. Scaffolding for the ceiling alterations. Original lighting now hidden behind the new ceiling. These auditorium photos may be more than 25 years old, so further changes may have been made. This shows the former cinema exit from the mid-balcony and where it comes out into the balcony foyer. The stairs down to the ground floor foyer. Carpet in a surviving sample. The projection room, the projectors disposed of. No one in charge knew where they'd gone. Along the back wall are the Western Electric stereophonic amplifiers introduced with CinemaScope. A later visit revealed they'd all gone, and the room was almost completely filled with a huge water tank. A crowded scene in the Kingsway when the Donalds ran the bingo there. Known as the Grandie, this is the view from Craigie Street and what replaced it. Looking at the right-hand side of the foyer, the opposite side, and the stepped feature on the left of the stair was lit up when the cinema was open. The Donalds widened the proscenium arch when CinemaScope arrived. The length of the footlights on the stage may give a clue to the width of the original opening. I suspect these supporting props are a late introduction. Like the Playhouse, it had pressed metal ceiling panels. The Grand Central Western Electric amplifier survives. As the balcony seems to be so close to the main roof, you wonder if in fact it was a later addition to try and increase the capacity. Here's the exterior of the Grand Central at night, taken by Ron Miller and Fred McLeod, who had the foresight to take their 16mm movie cameras along and record the Grandie, as it was, the Grand Central was known. And here we see the inside foyer, obviously, and some customers, and very interesting record for me. This is in the projection box, and here's Lenny Knowles, the second projectionist, adjusting the carbon rods. He's waiting for a changeover here with his hand on the switch. He switched on the new machine, and there's the changeover onto the next reel. So he's checking that the film's running through all right by having a look at it. There's the carbon. The end of the rods have to be against these lines to be in the right position. He's checking again that it's all running well. And now he's winding the previous reel back to the beginning so that it's ready for the next showing. So here he is again, looking again at the carbons. They needed a lot of attention to raise them up and down and backwards and forwards, sideways, so that they were always in the correct position to give the best possible light for the screen. He's checking the sound head at the bottom there. And now he's threading up. And as it's a cinemascope film, he's placed the cinemascope lens in place. He's opening the arc door to see the tremendous light that comes from the burning carbons. Here's the chief, Ronnie Dunbar, and he's putting new carbon rods into the arc ready for the next reel. Because each reel, because the carbons are burned away, you have to adjust them so there's plenty left to last out the reel. He's switched on, he's struck them up by touching them together. And this is Fred MacLeod, who, with Ron, is part of the film making. And he's waiting on a changeover. He's got his hand on the switch there. He was a projectionist at the Astoria, Kitty Brewster. And Ronnie is going to the wine bench with the reel that's just changed. And we've frozen it here, so you can see the slide lantern. It told the audience that there were ices and confectionery available and cigarettes. It was also advertising film showing on Sundays, the Donald's other entertainment venues like the ice rink, as well as during the wartime it was important to be able to transmit messages to people in the audience who were either servicemen or in the civil defence or the police, in order that they would know immediately to leave their seats and go to the meeting point. This is Ronnie. He's taken the aperture plates out and he's putting the new ones in. The aperture plates decide the shape of the film by masking off the picture area, and he's now putting a lens up. This is during the course of an evening, so it's not just, you're not seeing it in strict time order. He's having a look at the film there, checking it, and now he's winding the reel back to the beginning. And there we are, and there's the Grand Central these years ago. Originally known as the Picturedrome, which opened in 1910 and changed its name in 1924 to the Cinema House, the frontage in 1935. It closed and went over to Bingo in 1971. The interior in the 1980s in Bingo mode. The small balcony. The red velvet seats removed and stacked at the back. I bought 100 from Dick Donald for £100, and the same seats more recently filled with a class of London school children, used for storage. Surviving. A label on the back says Cinema House, but I never saw it there. Surviving. Above the Cinema House there were two halls, this one with a proscenium and stage at the far end. It had been used for rehearsals in the past, probably when the Donalds owned and ran His Majesty's Theatre. When these photos were taken in the late 80s, the Donalds used it for storage. The Queen's Cinema. The Queen's Restaurant, which preceded the cinema. The facade on Union Street and on the corner of Back Wynd, where Herbert Donald had an optician's shop. After closure in 1981, it marked the end of James F. Donald's. The cinema sign. The only Donald cinema where the projection room was off-centre. The box on the upper left is the entry into the balcony. The Queen's became a nightclub, and here we see an early version of Eagle's Nightclub run by Dick Donald's son Ian. The entry to the balcony is seen upper left. This was taken soon after it opened, and it will very unlikely to look anything like this now. Control board for the Queen's battery charging dynamo survives. Aberdeen's Queen's Cinema was destroyed by fire in September 1936. Taken from lower down Union Street, the colonnade of St Nicholas Kirkyard Centre and the Queen's behind. The fire engine at the mouth of Back Wynd with hoses going through the front door. The ladder in Back Wynd. Busy Union Bridge and the dense smoke blotting out the lower half of Union Street. The smoke through the tramway cables with St Nicholas Kirkyard seen again and the Queen's in the background. Back Wynd and a glimpse on the left of Herbert Donald's optician shop, opened 5 years earlier, having moved from Market Street. He was part owner and general manager of the Queen's, among other Aberdeen cinemas. Seen in Union Street. The interior was rebuilt and reopened in May 1937. This time the screen was at the Union Street end, the reverse of before the fire. It closed in 1981 and later became a nightclub. The Casino. Known colloquially as the Cassash, it was in the East End and was the only Aberdeen cinema to have a projection room on the ground floor under the balcony. In the 1960s, I bought the stage curtains. As the Beach Boulevard was developed, most of the nearby properties were swept away. This is the Belmont, about 1949. It still survives as a cinema, although it was closed for many years, from 1952, the first closure of the 50s, when it became a NAFI headquarters, and then a carpet warehouse. Originally a trades hall, it had opened as the Coliseum in 1910, became the New Kinema in 1921, and the Belmont, the name of the street it's in, during 1935. It was commonly referred to, even many years later, by the nickname the Flecky Belmont, connected with catching fleas in it. It was the last cinema in the city to have wooden forms at the front, and the last one to show serials. The rear shutter Gormont Eclipse projectors and sound heads survive. Unable to place this in any other of the Donald cinemas, I wonder if this 1930s still frames had been used there. The Odeon was originally the Regent. And here we've Scott Sutherland again, who was the architect. Built by an Edinburgh exhibitor who had a wide range of entertainment interests, John Poole. Here in the opening programme is also his 21-year-old son, who was to be manager, bottom right. And on the bottom left is someone who was a central character in Aberdeen cinemas at one time. Here he's the general manager to be Bert Darley. He's listed as having been in 15 films as an actor and may have done theatre work. His birth name was Herbert Fletcher, and he'd previously been manager of the Picture House, later the Gaumont, when he'd gone out with my aunt for a while, although he appears also to have had a wife at some point. Bert Darley's on the left with Jack Poole's son in a picture in the Bonaccord Weekly newspaper. Left to right, Bruce Mackenzie, the contractor, Bert Darley, and the architect Scott Sutherland. This shows the entrance finished and the framework of the auditorium behind, frontage, and below the cinema interior. A window card advertising the Regent as the Odeon. You can see above the frontage the Odeon sign on metal rods that later came down and was replaced by small fluorescent lit boxes along the front. And this is it looking from the lane down into Union Glen. It celebrated its 50 years in March 1982 with a gala showing of On Golden Pond. Some of the uniformed staff of the Aberdeen Cinema, the Regent, at its opening in 1932. Here is the Odeon, celebrating its 50th anniversary in 1982 with a special premiere of On Golden Pond, having changed its name in 1940 to Odeon. The doorman, in a uniform borrowed from the local Donald's cinemas. This is J.K. Stafford Poole, whose father Jack Poole was behind the cinema's creation. Aged 21 at the opening, he was the first resident manager. Introducing himself to the manager, the return visit must have revived many memories of the early days. Orange juice for sale, again with a borrowed uniform from the local Donald's cinemas. George Raitt in the centre, the assistant manager who grew up in Ellen. I hope the wrinkled screen wasn't as obvious to the cinema goers watching these clips or trailers. A rather self-conscious staff lineup. Ice cream sales in the balcony. A busy foyer stall. Someone without a ticket. The Palace was a former theatre erected in 1887 that later burnt down and was rebuilt, opening in 1898. Then it was extensively reconstructed in 1931 after talkies arrived as a cinema with the same name. Here the screen is being installed, and this is what it looks like from the front. Notice the little finial at the top of that pediment, which is seen here from the roof, with the present ridged roof on the left. And at the opposite end, another finial. The former interior above the suspended ceiling of the nightclub, which extends to the proscenium and stage just from below the balcony. Another view. Note the small decorative opening on the left and a close-up of it. The former balcony and projection room windows. Remnants of wall decoration. The former projection room. Looking over the facade at Bridge Place on the left and Bath Street to the right, and in between the once and maybe still Royal Hotel, where my now pregnant mother booked in with her soldier lover and me to get grounds for a divorce. Regrettably, the subpoenaed room service maid could not in court remember seeing them in bed together, so the whole exercise was a waste of time. The Gaumont, originally the Picture House, which had opened in 1914, the monthly free programme. On Union Street, the entrance, almost opposite the end of Diamond Street. The Horseshoe Interior, another of Jim Brooks' wonderful photos. I found it a very intimate, cosy place, always warm, with thick curtains you had to wrestle through to get in. The News Cinema. Most of the large cities had a news cinema pre-war, with programmes of news, travel, comedy, cartoon films, making about an hour's lightweight programme, very popular with visitors who could wait in the warm, be entertained, and easily leave without being involved in a gripping story or plot. Picture in the Bonaccord Weekly of preparations for the Diamond Street News Cinema in 1936. The man behind it, Ernest Bromberg, had a 35mm Bell & Howell IMO camera and covered local events on film which were shown in the cinema. A big scoop came during the war when a German aircraft was shot down. The film was rushed to London, processed and included in the weekly Paramount National Newsreel. In 1955 it became the New Cine. They tried showing continental films, then changed further to the Curzon, and then later went over to cartoons. Then Mr. Bromberg, who started it in 1936, sold it in late 1963 to Singleton Cinemas, a Glasgow company known for their central Glasgow flagship, the Cosmo. Named Cosmo 2, it ran good quality world cinema. The facade, and to the left, beyond the showcases, the entry to the Palais de Danse, by now the Palais Ballroom. Arthur Buchanan, manager of the Cosmo, came north as the general manager of both venues. I was the assistant general manager. This is a school party for the season of Shakespeare-related films during his Quater centenary. One memorable novelty was the showing of an old serial, with each episode following on. To promote it, Columbia Pictures offered a costume loan to get more publicity. And there I am on the canopy of the Cosmo. Robin, I'm afraid I've forgotten his name, was the son of Betty Duncan, who was in the pay desk. Batman and a Mini are not two words that immediately fit together, but we toured the town getting publicity and a great deal of interest. I had a ginger goatee beard and had to have a new mask made up which concealed it, but a child noticed it and called me out as a fraud, although I would have thought the skinny legs would have already exposed the duplicity. Looking towards the screen, I left for London in the mid-60s to join the British Film Institute. Cosmo 2 closed in 1977. In 1981, the Palais, subleased to a disco operation, caught fire and both buildings were damaged and destroyed. St. Catherine's Hall of 1878 became a cinema in 1906 as the Gaiety, later the Palladium, which ended with the silent films, and the site was bought in 1937 by ABC Cinemas. Building started, but was halted by the war, and I well remember looking through the gated passageway of the entrance at the bare walls, the open skeleton of the roof ironwork, and the luxuriant foliage, shrubs, and small trees growing between the walls. And the new cinema, the Regal, opened in 1954. A proposed drawing. Note the height of the roof. Not as high as it was in the sketch. The Union Street entrance when it was named the ABC. The original interior before division. It was demolished and a new cinema took its place. I've been in the past accused of stealing Scotland's heritage. No, it was all bought and paid for, and an entirely volunteer, unfunded, charitable organisation founded to safeguard it. Thousands have enjoyed seeing Aberdeen and other material over the past 37 years. Thank you for listening and looking. And now a frame from the Diamond Street new cinema film.